The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, carried across the breakfast room on a tray, so polished it caught the pale October light and threw it briefly across the ceiling. It bore the royal household's seal. No one at Bramwell Hall could recall, in all the years of its long and quietly fading history, ever receiving a letter with that particular mark upon it. The footman who carried it did not know what it contained. The housekeeper who saw it pass did not know either. Only one person in that entire house would come to understand, in the weeks that followed, precisely what that letter meant. And she was, at that very moment, standing in a muddy, overgrown corner of the estate garden that everyone else in the family had long since agreed to forget. She did not open the letter herself, not at first. She simply stood among the broken hives of an apiary no one had tended properly in 11 years. Her hands cold, her breath visible in the morning air, entirely unaware that the answer to a question her family had refused to ask for over a decade was about to come looking for her. Before we go further, if this is your first visit to our channel, we tell the forgotten stories of England's great estates and the women history quietly pushed aside. Subscribe now, because this story earns its ending. And while you're settling in, tell us in the comments below where in the world you're watching from tonight. We read every single one. To understand how Rosalind Fairclough came to be standing among broken hives on a cold October morning, one must go back 3 years to the spring she arrived at Bramwell Hall with a single trunk, a morning dress 2 sizes too large, and no expectation whatsoever of being welcomed. She was not, strictly speaking, a member of the family, not in any way the Duke of Ashworth was inclined to acknowledge at dinner. Her mother had been a distant cousin of the Duke's late wife, a woman who had married beneath her station and been quietly dropped from correspondence decades before. When both of Rosalind's parents died within a single terrible winter, leaving debts rather than inheritance, it was the Duke. More from a sense of obligation to appearances than any true warmth, who agreed to take the orphaned girl in. She was given a small room in the north wing, overlooking the kitchen gardens rather than the park. She was given tasks rather than a place, mending, correspondence, the tutoring of the younger cousins when a governess proved too costly to retain. She was, in the particular cruelty reserved for poor relations in great houses, treated as neither servant nor family, but as something suspended uncomfortably between the two. The Duke himself rarely spoke to her directly. When he did, it was with the distracted courtesy a man offers furniture he has grown accustomed to stepping around. Miss Fairclough will see to it, he would say of some tedious task, never quite meeting her eyes, and Miss Fairclough always did. She did not know then that the very quality that made her useful to the household, her quiet patience, her willingness to notice what others overlooked, would one day be the thing that changed everything. It was in her second autumn at Bramwell Hall that Rosalind first wandered into the old bee-yard, tucked behind the walled kitchen garden, hidden from the main house by an overgrown hedge of hawthorn that no gardener had trimmed in years. She had gone looking, in truth, for nothing more than a quiet place to sit with a book, away from the younger cousins and their endless demands. What she found instead was a small forgotten kingdom of collapsed hives, rotted wooden frames, and a low stone cottage with a caved-in roof, half swallowed by ivy. That bee-yard hasn't produced in years, the Duke told her flatly when she asked, that same evening, who had once kept it. He did not look up from his newspaper. Leave it be. There is nothing there worth your attention, but something in the way he said it, too quickly, too final, with a faint tightness around his mouth that had not been there a moment before, told Rosalind that the bee-yard was not, in fact, simply an abandoned corner of forgotten land. It was Mrs. Applewhite, the elderly cook who had served at Bramwell Hall for nearly 40 years, who first spoke the name Rosalind had never once heard uttered within those walls. That was Lady Miriam's yard, the old woman said quietly, one evening in the kitchen, as she showed Rosalind how to properly seal a jar of preserves. The Duke's own sister kept the finest bees in the county, she did, before she stopped herself, glancing toward the door as though afraid of being overheard even after so many years. Well, before it all ended the way it did. What happened to her? Rosalind asked. Mrs. Applewhite's hands stilled over the jar. Disgraced, she said simply. Cast out. Married a man far beneath her station, an apothecary's son from the village, if you can believe it, for all his cleverness with plants and herbs. The old Duke, her father, would not have it. Struck her name from the family Bible, he did, the very week she left. No one at Bramwell Hall has spoken of her since. Not properly. Not once. She did not know then that Lady Miriam had been dead for over a decade, nor that the story Mrs. Applewhite had just told her, the story every servant and family member at Bramwell Hall had quietly accepted as truth for 30 years, was not, in fact, entirely true. We're only a few minutes in, and already the mystery is taking root, so if you don't want to lose this story, subscribe now. And don't forget, we'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments below. Now back to Bramwell Hall. Rosalind returned to the bee yard the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, though she could not entirely explain to herself why. There was something in the quiet ruin of the place that called to her. The collapsed hives, still faintly patterned with old, careful paintwork. The cottage, half buried in ivy, that had clearly once been tended with love rather than neglect. It was on her third visit, while clearing ivy from the cottage's single window in hopes of letting in more light, that her hand brushed against a loose stone in the wall beside the hearth, a stone that gave, unexpectedly, beneath her fingers. Behind it was a small tin box, rusted at the corners, and inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth, gone brittle with age, was a journal. The Bee Book of Miriam Ashworth, the first page read, in a hand both elegant and precise. Begun this spring, in my 19th year, with hopes of understanding these small and patient creatures better than my father understands me. Rosalind sat on the cottage's cold stone floor for nearly an hour that afternoon, reading by the thin grey light through the newly cleared window, entirely forgetting the time, entirely forgetting the cold. The journal was not merely a record of hives and harvests. It was the private mind of a young woman who had loved bees with a scientist's precision and a poet's tenderness, who had studied the particular foraging patterns of the wild heather on the estate's eastern hill, the rare lime trees along the old carriage drive, the wild thyme that grew nowhere else in the county but Bramwell's southern meadow. I begin to believe Miriam had written, in an entry dated some months before the journal's final pages, that the particular character of our honey, its clarity, its scent of heather and lime together, unlike anything I have tasted from any other estate, comes from a foraging range no other apiary in the county possesses. If I am right, this honey is not merely good, it is singular. She did not know then, reading those words for the first time by candlelight, smuggled from her own room, that Lady Miriam's singular honey would one day travel farther from Bramwell Hall than its long-dead keeper could ever have imagined. The journal's final entries grew shorter, more urgent, the handwriting less steady than the careful script of its earlier pages. Father says I am a disgrace, one entry read, dated only weeks before it ended entirely. He says Edwin is unsuitable, that his trade with herbs and simples is beneath the family name, though Edwin knows more of growing things, of bees, of flowers, of the soil itself, than any gentleman I have ever met at any ball my father has forced me to attend. I do not believe I am the disgrace here. I believe it is simply that I have chosen a happiness my father cannot control, and that, to a man like him, is unforgivable. The very last entry, dated the night before what Rosalind could only assume was Miriam's final departure from Bramwell Hall, was shorter still. I have asked Robert to keep the hives as best he can, until I might send for instructions. I do not believe Father will allow it, but I have asked all the same. If anyone should ever find this book after I am gone from this house, know that the bee yard was the only place at Bramwell where I was ever entirely myself. I hope, whoever you are, that you will let them produce again. They deserve better than silence. Rosalind closed the journal that evening, with her hands trembling, though not from cold. She did not know then who Robert had been, nor what had become of him, nor whether any instructions from Lady Miriam had ever arrived. But she understood, with a certainty that startled her, that she had just been handed something far more valuable than a forgotten hobby. She had been handed a woman's entire silenced life, and she found, sitting in that cold, ruined cottage, that she was no longer willing to let it remain silent. If Rosalind's discovery has you hooked, this is exactly the moment to subscribe, because the story only deepens from here. And if you haven't already told us, where are you watching from tonight? Comment below. We truly do read them all. Now, let's continue. Restoring the bee yard was not the work of a single season, nor was it work Rosalind could undertake without notice forever. She began quietly, in the hours before the household stirred and the hours after it settled, clearing broken frames, repairing what timber could be saved, learning, through trial and the patient guidance of Miriam's own careful notes, how to coax new colonies into the rebuilt hives. Mrs. Applewhite, once she understood what Rosalind had found, became a quiet co-conspirator, supplying beeswax and old linens, and, more valuably still, memories of Lady Miriam that added colour and detail to the journal's spare, careful entries. She used to hum to them, Mrs. Applewhite said one afternoon, watching Rosalind work with the careful, unhurried movements Miriam's journal had described. The bees, I mean, claimed they liked it. The old Duke thought it madness. I always thought it rather lovely. Myself, it was inevitable, of course, that the work would eventually be noticed. It was the Duke's nephew and heir apparent, Gerald Ashworth, who first raised the matter, not out of curiosity, but out of irritation, when he discovered Rosalind's small collection of jarred honey in the still room one afternoon, while searching for brandy. What is the meaning of this? He demanded of his uncle at dinner that evening, holding up a single jar as though it were evidence of some grave household failing. Miss Fairclough has apparently taken it upon herself to play at beekeeping in Aunt Miriam's old ruin. I should think we have quite enough embarrassment attached to that particular corner of the estate, without inviting more. The Duke's expression, Rosalind noted from her place at the far end of the table, tightened in precisely the same way it had the first time she had asked about the bee yard. The land in the eastern meadow, Gerald continued, before his uncle could speak, would fetch a fair price if sold for the new turnpike road they're proposing to run through the county. I have already had inquiries made. It seems a foolish waste to leave it tangled in bees and sentiment when it might instead ease certain, pressing obligations. She did not know then precisely what obligations Gerald meant, nor how deeply in debt the Ashworth estate had quietly become in recent years through Gerald's own poor management of the family's investments. But she understood, in that moment, that the bee yard and everything it represented was in far greater danger than she had realised. It was the Duke himself, unexpectedly, who came to find her in the bee yard the following week. The first time in 3 years he had sought her out for any purpose beyond assigning her some tedious task. He stood at the cottage door for a long moment before speaking, his eyes moving over the newly repaired hives, the cleared garden beds where Rosalind had begun, following Miriam's notes, to plant heather and thyme and the particular strain of clover the journal described as essential to the honey's singular character. "You found her book," he said, finally. It was not a question. Rosalind did not deny it. "I did, Your Grace. In the wall by the hearth." The Duke was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the hives, beyond the garden, beyond, perhaps, the present moment entirely. "She was the cleverest of all of us," he said at last, so quietly Rosalind nearly missed it. "Cleverer than I ever was. Our father could not forgive her for it, I think, not truly for the marriage, though that was the excuse he gave. He could not forgive that she wished for a life he had not chosen for her." He paused. "I was 23 when she left. I did not stop it. I have regretted that every year since, though I have never once said so aloud to anyone until this moment." She did not know then that this single halting confession would be the closest thing to an apology the Duke of Ashworth would ever offer anyone in his household, not for what he had failed to do for his sister 30 years before, and, though neither of them yet knew it, not for what he had failed to see in the quiet young woman standing before him now. "The land in the eastern meadow," she said carefully, "is where the heather grows that Lady Miriam believed made the honey what it was. If it is sold for the turnpike, it will not be sold," the Duke said, with a firmness that surprised them both. "Not while I have breath to prevent it." It was not, Rosalind understood, forgiveness for the past. But it was, perhaps, the first small step toward it. We're deep into Rosalind's story now, and if you're finding yourself invested in how this ends, please take a moment to subscribe. It helps more than you'd think. And of course, let us know where you're watching from down in the comments. Now, let's see what becomes of that remarkable honey. The bee yard produced its first true harvest that following summer, modest at first, but unmistakable in character. Mrs. Applewhite, tasting it in the kitchen on a warm July evening, went very still, then very quiet, then finally set down her spoon with an expression Rosalind had never before seen on the old woman's face. "That is Lady Miriam's honey," she said simply. "I have not tasted anything like it in 30 years. I did not believe I ever would again." It was Cecilia, no relation to the family, but a friend of the younger Ashworth cousins visiting from London for the summer, whose father sat on the committee of a prominent horticultural society, who first suggested, almost in passing over tea, that the honey ought to be entered in that autumn's county exhibition. Rosalind resisted the notion at first. She had restored the bee yard for Miriam's sake, and increasingly, she realised, for her own, not for exhibition, not for prizes, not for the attention of strangers who had never once thought to ask why a corner of Bramwell Hall's grounds had sat in ruin for over a decade. But Mrs. Applewhite, uncharacteristically insistent, pressed the matter, and in the end it was the memory of Miriam's own final written wish, "I hope you will let them produce again," that persuaded her. The honey won the county exhibition's highest commendation that October, judged by men who had never in 30 years tasted anything quite like its particular clarity, its scent of heather and lime blossom entwined. It was, the judges noted in their official report, unlike any honey produced elsewhere in the region, a character they attributed, correctly though they could not have known the full history behind it, to some singular quality of foraging ground found nowhere else in the county. She did not know then that among the guests invited to sample the exhibition's finest entries that year was a gentleman from London with quiet but considerable influence in matters of the royal household's provisioning, a man whose recommendation, once given, was rarely questioned. The second letter, the one that finally explained the first, arrived at Bramwell Hall in December, this time addressed directly to Miss Rosalind Fairclough, a fact that caused no small stir below stairs, where letters bearing royal seals were not, in the ordinary course of things, addressed to poor relations tending forgotten bee yards. It requested, with the particular formal courtesy of royal correspondence, a regular supply of the honey exhibited that autumn at the county show, for consideration in the provisioning of the royal household's table. It noted, in language carefully understated, but unmistakable in its meaning, that Her Majesty herself had found the sample provided to be, in the words used at table, quite unlike any other she had tasted. Rosalind read the letter twice in the quiet of her small north wing room before she fully believed what it said. She did not know then how swiftly word of a royal preference could travel through the county, through London, through the drawing rooms of families who had, only months before, never once thought to inquire after the poor relation quietly living out her days at Bramwell Hall. She did not know that within a year, Bramwell honey would become a name spoken with genuine admiration in circles that had never before had cause to speak the Ashworth name at all. She knew only, standing in her small room with the letter trembling slightly in her hands, that Lady Miriam's final written wish had at last, after 30 years of silence, been answered. We're nearly at the story's turn. This is usually where people tell us they're glad they subscribed early, so if you haven't yet, now's the moment. And if you're just joining us, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Let's finish Rosalind's story together. The Duke summoned the family, all of them, including Gerald, including the younger cousins, including, for the first time in 3 years, Rosalind herself seated not at the table's far end, but at his own right hand. For a formal dinner the week, the news became impossible to keep from spreading through the county entirely. I have made an error I have carried for 30 years, the Duke said, rising at the head of the table, his voice steadier than Rosalind had ever heard it. I allowed pride, and the good opinion of people whose opinions did not deserve the weight I gave them, to cost me my sister, and very nearly to cost this family the one truly singular thing it has ever produced. I will not make that error twice. He turned then to Gerald, whose earlier talk of turnpike roads and pressing obligations had, in the months since, grown notably quieter. The Eastern Meadow remains part of this estate, the Duke said. It will remain so as long as I have any say in the matter. And the bee yard, Miriam's bee yard, is no longer an experiment to be tolerated. It is under Miss Faircliff's permanent charge, with whatever land, funds and standing in this household that charge requires. It was not, in the end, the recovered honey, nor the royal letter, nor even the Duke's belated apology that Rosalind would remember most clearly from that winter. It was the small gesture that came after, when the Duke, before the assembled family, had a portrait of Lady Miriam, removed from the walls of Bramwell Hall 30 years before and long forgotten in a storage room, brought down and hung once more in the great hall, beside the other family faces that had never once been asked to explain themselves. She deserved better than silence, the Duke said quietly, echoing, though he did not know it, the very words his sister had written in the final page of a journal, hidden for 30 years, behind a loose stone in a cottage wall. Spring came again to Bramwell Hall, and with it, the bee yard bloomed more fully than it had in 3 decades. Heather and lime and wild thyme, tended now not in secret, not before dawn in stolen hours, but openly, with the full resources and standing of the household behind it. Rosalind Faircliff, once treated as neither family nor servant, suspended uncomfortably between the two, found herself, in the years that followed, in a position no one, least of all herself, could have predicted the morning she first wandered into an overgrown corner of forgotten land in search of nothing more than a quiet place to read. She had not restored the bee yard for recognition, nor for royal favour, nor even, in the end, entirely for herself. She had restored it because a woman she never met had once written, in a hand grown less steady with each passing page, that she hoped someone, someday, might let the hives produce again, and Rosalind had found, in that quiet hope left behind in a cold stone cottage, something worth honouring. She did not know, that first cold morning among the broken hives, that a letter bearing a royal seal would one day arrive addressed to her by name. She did not know that the Duke, who could barely meet her eyes across a dinner table, would one day rise before his entire family and speak her name with something approaching pride. She did not know that Lady Miriam's portrait would hang once more in the great hall, nor that her own quiet patience, the very quality that had made her invisible for so long, would become, in time, the thing that finally restored what 30 years of silence had nearly erased forever. She knew only. Standing now each spring among hives that hummed with the particular, singular life Miriam had first understood, and Rosalind had learned to understand in turn, that some inheritances are never written into any will. They wait instead, patiently, in forgotten corners, for someone willing enough, and patient enough, to notice them at all. If Rosalind and Lady Miriam's story stayed with you the way it stayed with us while writing it, please subscribe for more forgotten stories from England's great estates, and one last time, let us know in the comments where you watched this from tonight. We'll see you in the next one.